Sarah, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me on this, event of the 25th anniversary of TechTour. And it's really lovely to meet you and to talk with you. And I thought it'd be interesting to kind of reflect on past, present, future. In other words, how have you seen this European ecosystem, this ecosystem of investors, of entrepreneurs? How have you seen that kind of changing in the time that you've been involved with European investments?
Yeah, so no, thanks for the question. And I think, um, when I arrived 10 years ago into Amsterdam, there was still this large sentiment that, the US was, Silicon Valley, everything, how can we create more of that sort of environment? How do we mimic those behaviors? How
Mm,
do we become more commercial? How do we scale commercially, across Europe, which is just not one country like the US has? Like lots of comparisons came. And obviously I saw a lot of that as being an American by
mhm.
background. I think those themes kept up coming, to surface when I would meet with people. And I was a little bit surprised at just how much of a focus there was on either trying to replicate or mimic or get closer to an American model rather than at that time, I thought, just build on what the strengths of Europe are. But whether it's come out of COVID or just the whole movement of impact capital and social capital, I definitely think Europe has learned how to hone in more on its strengths, and build on this impact and social investment agenda, move away from the idea that that's philanthropic money, but focus and double down on areas like climate, and even health in my sector, right? Social indicators of health, impact weighted accounts. We're really leading the way, but from both a public policy perspective and also where capital is flowing privately, placing bigger bets in those spaces. And I think the US is watching Europe now in
Mm.
that sense. So it's a nice way to see, by geography, stay focused on the areas where you have really core strengths and
Mhm.
lead in the investment community there rather than try to mimic something somewhere else. And I think over time, within the European community, investment community, that's also becoming quite clear. So I've seen that shift a lot, and that brings more confidence here to investors, I think.
Mm, mm. As we're exploring this kind of uniquely European way of approaching this whole ecosystem here, I'm curious about one thing. And again, this is one of the things that I'm very interested in, is that I see how collaboration is such an essential key to success these days. We as human beings are learning that we are one life form on this planet. We have to collaborate to a greater extent. Do you see any differences between perhaps that US centric model, the European model, and kind of how we collaborate?
Yeah, for sure. I think particularly in the venture community,
Hmm.
whether you're the entrepreneur or you're the investor, the private equity play of bringing together disparate companies, which then could serve as pieces of a puzzle that you put together to form one solution in Europe, is a
Mm,
much stronger approach at an earlier stage,
mm,
or slightly earlier stage than you would think about it in the US because of the access to such large amounts of capital.
mm,
So, despite the current macroeconomic environment right now, normally speaking, right, if you're an entrepreneur, you can go out and raise significantly more capital than you could here in Europe, right,
mm,
within the US environment. And so that kind of drives you to be very independent, very autonomous, very much about your company, your objectives, your investors, and how much
mm,
money can you raise, which
mm.
always has, led to some debates about bubbles and, inflated valuations and things like that. I don't think we have that problem in Europe. Like, needless to say, that's not what we struggle with. So I think, if you, again, kind of getting back to the first conversation, if you're one of those entrepreneurs that's always looking and comparing yourself to somebody across the pond, it's going to be a difficult way for you to excel in Europe because it's just a completely different environment. Whereas here, it's about really being very good at what you do and
Mm,
then partnering not with just strategics, large corporates for proof of concepts and pilots, but with other companies that
mm,
actually could make your value proposition in combination, can make your value proposition stronger and more of an attractive target in combination than you would separately, and therefore attract larger amounts of capitals as a combined offer.
That's really, really interesting, and it's fun to contrast those two. Not to say that one is necessarily better or worse, but because we're here in Europe and the fundamental chemistry is different, it's fun to see that emerging as a different, as an alternative way of thinking. I live in Norway, and it's a small community, and somehow there's a small town mentality in Oslo, in Norway as a country that you don't find to that same extent in the States. And so it's really interesting to see. Hey, Sarah, as a kind of a final question, and it's a hard one to answer because we live in times that are changing so rapidly. And, we're at a bizarre time in human history right now with the way things are accelerating. But if you were to put on your wizard cap and look into the future, what do you see emerging in terms of how we work together, how we collaborate, how we work within these investment, entrepreneurial environments? Any clues or any suggestions on how the future looks?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's cropping up now, and I see within, let's call it, I'm in my 40s, so like within, I guess, my level of generation and below,
Hmm.
I start to see it's almost like a B2C approach to democratizing venture. So
Mm,
what you have in the climate space, for example, there's a company here locally in the Netherlands that has made it accessible. Now you still have a certain price tag that you have to pay,
mhm,
but you can, create a collaborative that forms one LP that now has access to a number of different funds. So it's like a fund of fund model,
mhm,
assuming you have some capital to play with, and you don't have to be an ultra high net worth to do this. Can now make investments in funds.
mm,
Whereas
mm,
before that was never, that's a closed door that, to
mm,
be LP in a fund is a completely different story. But by sort of crowdsourcing and aggregating funding from individuals,
mhm,
you now create a collaborative LP. And
mhm,
that goes in now and makes investments in a number of different funds where those individuals would never have otherwise had access to
mhm,
be able to, touch that type of investment capital. So that's a really interesting model that I see coming. And it's a way to bring more individuals into the fold, almost like a B2C
mhm,
model of venture investing, going beyond just a standard angel and a super ultra high net worth that wants to help an entrepreneur out. So I find that to be an interesting model. I've seen it now in climate already. It's being done successfully. But I've had calls just recently this week with folks who are interested in setting it up in the health sector as well.
mm,
So I
mm,
find that, that's a really an area that I think will grow.
mhm,
I also see, talking about sort of this democratization or opening up of the venture space, trends of micro funds. So
mm,
small amounts
mm,
of funds, right, that don't require all the resources and overhead because now you have digital data science applications that are supporting venture. So funds that used to be people heavy can now be a little bit more people light
mm,
and very specific, using technology as a horizontal layer, saying
mhm,
I can, if I have expertise in this technology horizontal, I can actually invest in a number of different industry verticals. It's
mm,
agnostic to the
mm,
industry vertical. So I can do a number of different funds at smaller sizes, smaller tickets. So the whole model to me of venture is starting to change, which I think is quite refreshing, right?
yeah, yeah,
And does open up the aperture, one, for more investments, different kinds of companies to come in, but
mhm,
two, also for an individual investor to play a larger role,
mm,
and get more involved in spaces that used to only be available if you were an LP in a standard venture fund.
yeah.
So those are
Well,
exciting things to see.
that's really exciting. And what I really love about what you're saying, Sarah, is that the, one of the core one of the core roles that TechTour plays is encouraging the diversity, the incredible diversity that's available in the European investor or European entrepreneurial community, encouraging these companies to bubble up. Some of them will make it to VC, some of them won't. That's fine. It's just making sure that we have access to great ideas. And listening to you talk, it's also interesting to see that there are new ideas popping up in how we invest and how we work together and how we collaborate, capitalizing on those ideas. And it's exciting to see that emerging.
Yeah.
So thank
And
you
I
so
see
much.
TechTour not
Go
just on
ahead.
the entrepreneur side, but one thing about TechTour I will say is, I mean, my experience too, coming in to the European VC community several years back, TechTour was just a friendly community. It was a
Mm,
place where, before I would get in because of the corporate name that was behind, that was
sure.
on my business card. But here it was, Tech Tour was always a place where if you were a new investor, if you looked different than the average investor, if you had a little bit more diversity or different thought to yourself as coming into the venture space, Tech Tour was a safe place to learn,
Mm,
to go,
mm, Mm.
to develop.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, I think many people have that sort of fond experience when they get involved in the tech tour community.
Oh, that's a great testimonial to, what they're doing at TechTour. TechTour. You're right. It is a diverse group, but that diversity becomes a real strength and can become a real asset in the future. So again, thank you so much, Sarah. Appreciate your time and it's fun to be part of this welcoming or this congratulating TechTour on 25 years.
Absolutely.